Привit moi druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes. I'm a professor who's been trying to help you understand what's going on in Ukraine, to give some context and engage in some sense making about what's actually happening. So today I want to talk about the United Nations, the role of the Security Council, and what we might expect as we move forward. So I want to start here. President Zelensky was just talking about how absurd it is that Russia, the state that's involved in running over its neighbor, is now going to be chairing the UN Security Council, which it does sound absurd, but I'll make some sense out of that. And that's his speech just a couple of days ago. So the UN Security Council changes hands. The presidency, the chair of the Security Council, on a rotating basis between 15 nations. So, and it goes in alphabetical order by the name of the state. So it's now April, it's the Russian Federation's turn. Then it's going to be Switzerland, then the UAE, then the United Kingdom, then the United States, Albania, Brazil, China, Ecuador. Now, China, the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Russia are permanent members. So there's no way to really just say, no, you don't have any authority to do that. But if you look at what the role of this is the presidency of the United Nations Security Council. If you look at the roles and responsibilities, there's not really a lot of responsibilities. They're the face of the UN Security Council, but they're supposed to be presenting, here's what the consensus of the council is, and they they can control the agenda and convene things. So they do have a little power, but not a whole lot. The president. Now, here's an interesting thing. The president of the Security Council also continues to represent their state. So, Lavrov is going to be taking up, or his ambassador is going to be taking up for Russia. If their nation is involved in a conflict in the UNSC, is discussing, they are expected to temporarily step down, and they haven't, and that's part of the controversy. So what power does the UN Security Council have? Now, this is the ambassador, the Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebezhny, and you'll see him in just a moment. But what powers does the UN Security Council actually have? This is Voice of America. The 15-nation Security Council is the UN's most powerful organ, and it's not a very powerful organization. They can express moral outrage, but they can't really do a whole lot. But here, it can authorize military action, deploy peacekeepers, sanction nations and individuals, and refer possible war crimes cases to the International Court. These are all things that Russia does not want to happen to itself, so it's probably not going to authorize additional military action, probably not going to deploy peacekeepers to Ukraine, probably not going to sanction nations or individuals, and not pass on war crimes cases to the ICC. So the worst case scenario, I think, with this is, one, it is a terrible look for the UN that Russia is actually in charge of this right now. Terrible look. But beyond the optics, not a lot of bad things can happen. But what kinds of things will happen at the UN Security Council, or what kind of statements might be made? Well, to give you a foreshadowing of what might come, let's look back about a week ago or so. I did this video where I showed Timothy Snyder talking about rusophobia. He was invited to speak to the UN Security Council, and he was invited to speak to them because the Russians had convened an emergency meeting on the nature of rusophobia. And I showed that, and I paused and talked about things along the way, and he did an awesome job. But then I didn't show what followed after that, and I'm going to show you what followed after that. So let's go back to this. This is Timothy Snyder just wrapping up his last couple lines of what he was talking about rusophobia. And then I'm going to show you what the Russian ambassador said next.
In this sense, in calling this session, the Russian state has found a new way to confess to war crimes. Thank you for your attention.
Wow, that was a powerful ending, and I think he was right. And if you haven't seen that video, go back and watch that video. That's like one of the best videos that I've put together in a long time, because it's largely not my words, it was Timothy Snyder's. Okay, so what happened after that?
I thank Mr. Snyder for his briefing. I now give the floor to those members of the Security Council who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation. You have the floor, sir.
Господин
Okay, buckle your seatbelts because this is going to be kind of painful. Now, before he talks, I want to tell you this. What the Russians say is often half the truth. They'll talk about, they called this thing on rusophobia, but they're not talking about what they did to cause the rusophobia. No, no, no. They're going to talk about it as if it justifies Russian hostility. Watch.
председатель,
President, we thank Kirill Wyshinsky and Dmitry Vasilits for their briefings. Each one of them has a bitter personal experience of encountering Russophobia in Ukraine. They've seen with their own eyes and from the inside how this state transformed into a Russophobic anti-Russian. I would like to hear something from Mr. Snyder, namely examples of what he so deliberately lied about today.
Look at this. He's calling him a liar already, and he's asking for examples from someone who can't answer back.
Where did he hear these despicable calls on Russian television from both official and unofficial with regard to Ukrainian and Ukrainians? Those examples that he cited, there simply aren't any such examples.
You can go to RT.com and look for yourself and see lots of evidence of Russians saying horrible, horrible things about Ukraine.
Claims. Mr. Snyder has been known for a long time for his historical hoaxes. The aim of that all boils down to an attempt to prove that Russians allegedly never lived in Ukraine, and that to prove that this state has an independent, centuries-long, if not millennia-long history.
So Timothy Snyder is a historian who taught a course on Ukraine at Yale that went back to the ancient roots of Ukraine, and it contradicts the Russian narrative that Ukraine is not a nation.
I can only sympathize with him because such fairy tales and attempts at historical engineering have...
Which is exactly what the Russians are doing. Fairy tales, historical engineering, revising that this never actually was a thing. It was like this instead.
Have shattered against the historical facts. Ukrainians in the late 19th and early 20th century were called not a people, but rather they were adherents of a certain ideology. They opposed themselves to Russia and Tsarism, of course, and they were against others. And the Ukrainians put themselves against, or rather above, other ethnic Russians living outside of the Russian Empire.
Which is kind of the same thing as what the Russians did to the Ukrainians, putting themselves above Ukrainians on their own soil. They did that to Lithuanians, they did that to Poles. So the Russians have done that everywhere they've gone. So again, what you will see the Russians do is call their opponents the things, or say that they're doing the things that the Russians themselves did, and they'll only tell half the story. Keep watching.
Those such as, for example, Mikhail Grushevsky, whose pseudo-historical works have become canonical in Ukraine and today, for political reasons, are actively promoted in the West, too, specifically by Mr. Snyder, too. Or there's Nikolai Mikhanovsky and Dmitry Dontsov. They set out the principles of integrated Ukrainian nationalism. The principles here...
His point, though, is that Ukraine is not an actual nation. It's a fiction. It's this made-up thing, and it doesn't actually count.
Incidentally, are quite unimaginative, and they're based, as was the German Nazi doctrine, on the supremacy of the Ukrainian nation over others. The main principle that they formulated sounds like this, I quote, Mongols, Hungarians, Poles, and Jews are the enemies of the Ukrainian people. Precisely this is the reason why Russophobia has become the bulwark of the ideology of an independent Ukraine, and this process has tangibly accelerated after the so-called Orange Resolution of 2004 in particular.
Okay, hold on a second. So Russophobia is the dominant ideology. What caused that? Okay, and it goes back to 2004. Sure, there are events that caused this in 2004, in 2008, in 2014, and 2022. So in another video, I showed survey data showing that the Ukrainians were very friendly toward the Russians before 2014. And then something happened, and they went from 90+% favorability down to now 2% favorability toward Russia. And it's like he doesn't even seem to factor that in.
Particularly after the anti-constitutional coup d'etat, which happened in 2014.
Anti-constitutional coup d'etat. The people rose up against what the elected official did. The elected official, the president, in 2014, fled to Russia after that. That wasn't a coup d'etat. That was, they were trying to get an agreement to force him to do a particular thing with the will of the people, and he fled.
It's already been mentioned here, but I'll repeat it without delving into the historical details, that according to the census of 2001, those who felt that they were Russian in Ukraine numbered 17.3% of the population, who mainly lived in the east and in the south of Ukraine. Nearly 30% of the population considered Russian to be their native language. Mm-hmm. But as the briefer mentioned, in everyday life, many more people speak Russian. The extent to which Russian was spread all over Ukraine at the time of the aforementioned events, you can see that extent from the fact that in 2004, 95% of all books published in Ukraine were in Russian. The new nationalistic authorities immediately carried out a brutal attack on the Russian language, and
as did the Russians when they first came into Ukraine. So there was a push by the Russians to override the language. The Ukrainians, when they became Ukraine officially in the 90s, actually pushed that back and said, you know what, this isn't going to be that way anymore. And after 2014, they had even more punitive laws that were pushing Russia out of being the mainstream official language. Now, with that being said, it's not like Russian speakers were being persecuted just for speaking Russian. It's just it wasn't the official thing anymore. Even Zelensky grew up speaking Russian, like that's his primary language. Hello? I mean, but they're going to make it sound like, so these people are just being persecuted. Well, what did the Russians do to everywhere that they went? All the satellites that they went into, Ukraine or Lithuania or Poland, wherever they went, they persecuted the people.
On everything Russian in general. They did this through school, education, the cinema, television. They inculcated the idea that everything Russia was foreign, and as a result in Ukraine, an entire generation was brought up in the spirit of the doctrine of Minkowski and Donetsk, saying that Russians were the enemies and that Ukrainians were a supreme nation, and they said that the Russians destroyed everything, including religion, language, literature, and culture.
Well, they did have some kind of evidence here. They did have the Holodomor. They did have domination by the Soviet Union. So I have a hard time faulting them for thinking that Russian may not be associated with the more pleasant things in life.
They rewrote history. Those who were the heroes of those who were serving the fascists and carried out evil acts. As a result of the anti-constitutional coup d'etat in 2014, Ukraine defended...
Again, he's asserting this is an anti-constitutional coup d'etat rather than explaining what actually happened and going into the background. This is part of the way that Russia does things. They just assume their perspective to be true.
Definitively became an anti-Russia, and rusophobia was exalted to the status of a state policy. The activists of the Maidan did not hide their misanthropic, rusophobic views. And
nor does Russia hide its misanthropic, Ukrainophobic views. And watch RT, and you will see them call them cockroaches and rats and all kinds of things, calling the Ukrainian people lesser than human. Watch it. Go ahead. You'll see he'll prove that Timothy Snyder is correct.
Their foreign sponsors were very, very much aware of that fact. Just a few days after the bloody change in regime, the extremist right sector leader Dmitry Roth said that de-Russification is a just and necessary phenomenon. The Russophobe and the deputy of the Ukrainian parliament.
So part of de-Russification is de-Sovietization and removing all things Soviet, because the Ukrainians don't want to be reminded of upwards of a century of being dominated by a neighbor that they didn't want on their soil.
Called all Russian speakers mentally challenged. And the mayor of Dnipropetrovsk, Boris Filatov, said, we need to give any promises or guarantees to Russian-speaking scum, and we'll just hang them later on. I'm giving you these quotes so that you understand the brazen rusophobia coming from the new authorities.
Now, in the Tim Snyder episode, I talked about how if there's Russophobia, why don't we talk about Ukrainophobia? It turns out that the Russians are pretty Ukrainophobic to the point that they're spending billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of Russian lives to try to dominate Ukraine yet again, because there's something so terrifying about an independent and free Ukraine to the Russians that they feel that this is a thing to do.
That Russian-speaking Ukrainians have encountered since the coup d'etat in 2014.
Third time he talked about the coup d'etat in 2014. Again, not a coup d'etat.
These authorities were prepared to destroy and to burn them. This was clearly demonstrated when 40 Russian-speaking activists were burned alive in the trade union's house in Odessa in May of 2014.
Okay, so I don't condone burning alive 40 pro-Russian whatever. I don't. But when did it happen? May of 2014. What just happened just before that? Russia seized Crimea and annexed it in March of 2014. You think there's some bad blood there? Do you think there's some reason, some event that preceded it? But he's not talking about that at all. He just glosses over that as if that didn't matter or that didn't happen.
One of the first decisions of the new regime was an attempt to repeal the law on the basis of the state language policy. Pursuant to that law, Russian language had the status of a regional language in 13 out of the 24 oblasts in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. This precise step triggered the departure from Ukraine of Crimea. The overwhelming majority of Crimea believes themselves to be Russian. The threat to the destruction of...
Again, he's asserting that, but that's not necessarily true.
One's native languages and attempts to impose as heroes Nazi henchmen and criminals was the key.
Now that's the overstatement of the year. It's not like they're trying to go, you know what, we wish that the Germans had won and Nazi Germany was a thing. They're not doing that. They are very supportive of someone like Bandera, who was not praised because he was a Nazi. He was praised because he was a Ukrainian nationalist.
Principle behind the just protest of the residents of the Donbass, where over 80% of residents used Russian every day. It should be noted that the Maidan authorities understood that the linguistic process was a very acute one and could lead the country to split, which is the reason why the repeal of this law was delayed. When signing the Minsk agreements, Kiev even agreed to include in them the linguistic self-determination for the Donbass. However, as we know, the Kiev regime never intended to implement those commitments.
And the Minsk agreement should never have happened because Russia totally forgot about the Budapest Memorandum, where when they gave up their nukes, the US, the UK, and Russia guaranteed their borders for giving up their nukes. But, hey, who's to talk about that right now?
For 9 years, the Ukrainian authorities deliberately destroyed everything that could have even somehow remotely been related to Russia. In so doing, they undermined the basis of a society which for many centuries was a cultural and civilizational unity together with our country as a result of 6 legal initiatives.
Okay, if you want to talk about unity, if you're looking for unity with Ukraine, you're going about it all wrong, okay? Invading your neighbor doesn't win friends and influence people. If you look at the polls before and after both 2014 and 2022's invasion, you lost the desire of any Ukrainians to be anywhere near you.
Adopted under Poroshenko, the Russian language was removed from all areas of public life, and tough quotas were linguistic quotas.
And at one point, the Russians did that to the Ukrainians when the Russians dominated Ukraine. And in the 4 oblasts that you have taken over illegally, you're doing the same thing, wiping out Ukrainian and making them speak Russian and learn about Russian history in schools and that kind of thing. So I mean, it's a little unfair to say that the Ukrainians are bad, they're doing this, and not say, well, we're bad too, because we're doing it the other way.
The mass media were introduced. There were attempts to discriminate against Russian in everyday life, too. These measures violated international documents, but also the Ukrainian constitution, the rights to the protection of linguistic, educational, and other rights of citizens and national minorities. I won't delve into the details about the discrimination in Ukraine against the Russian language and Russian speakers. Both of the briefers that we invited spoke about that in detail, but I'd like to recall that President Zelensky, during his presidential campaign, said that he promised to review the linguistic laws which had driven a wedge into the already polarized Ukrainian society. I would like to merely tell you what he said. He did this on a Ukrainian television channel. This was even before he became president. I quote, "In eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, people want to speak Russian. Leave them alone. On a legal foundation, you should give them the ability to speak Russian. Language is never going to divide our native country. I have Jewish blood. I speak Russian.
He does.
But I'm a citizen of Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine are truly fraternal peoples."
Well, they were once upon a time until the Russians actually invaded and made that very improbable going forward. In the East, there was double-digit support, and it could be 20-30% support for Russia before the invasion. Now, after the invasion, it's down across the country, down to 2%. I mean, that's pretty low.
And all of us understand one another very well. Largely due to this position and due to the promises to establish a civil war in Donbass, the presidential election of 2019 saw rather 3/4 of Ukrainians vote for him. However, very quickly, the new head of the Ukrainian state showed that this was nothing but empty words for him. He quickly fell into line with the plan of Kiev's patrons as regards the preservation of international peace around Ukraine and its good neighborly relations with Russia. He armed his country with Western assistance and prepared for war with Russia under the cover of the Minsk agreements, and today we have no doubt about that, thanks to revelations by the former leaders of France, Germany, and Great Britain.
So he prepared for war with Russia. Was Russia preparing for war with Ukraine during that time?
So doing, he took a number of steps in order to eliminate the Russian language and everything Russia from his country. In 2020 and 2021, discriminatory laws on secondary education were introduced, and on the indigenous peoples of Ukraine, and on the national patriotic education. In September of 2021, Zelensky called upon all the Ukrainian residents who felt that they were Russian to leave the country. And he called...
Now, this is a little bit of a stretch here, because he's saying, look, if you don't like the country, if you like Russia better, leave, go to Russia. Now, nobody's saying anybody in Russia is being persecuted. You can go to Russia and speak Russian. That's your country. But in Ukraine, we're going to speak Ukrainian. That's essentially what it was.
This and their internal choice. If, he said, you want to live in Ukraine, and if you see the future of your children and your grandchildren there, then you are obligated to become Ukrainian, and you need to renounce your Russian identity. Anybody who did not want to do that, including the residents of the Donbass, were prompted by bombings and artillery strikes, or simply to leave, or were simply physically destroyed, that is, killed.
Again, the one side of the story seems to show that the Ukrainian government was just bullying those people in the Donbass, whereas there was a civil insurrection prompted and supported and aided by Russia, who was undergirding this to pull away. So it's a lot more to the story.
I wish to stress in particular that all these measures were not a response to Russia's actions, but rather they were an initiative, and they were a deliberate attempt to destroy the Russian language and culture in Ukraine.
Because words are violence, not like actual violence which, is happening, being inflicted daily on Ukraine by Russia. That's okay. But words, that really hurts. So don't do that. That's terrible.
Thus, there was an egregious violation of the rights of the Russian-speaking population. After February of 2022, the fight against the Russian language in Ukraine took on grotesque forms, and there were also terrible associations with Nazism here. Ukrainian officials didn't hide the fact that they...
Notice that they talk about terrible association with Nazism, or there are Nazis. Where are the Nazis? Like, show me who is going, hey, I'm a Nazi, Heil, that kind of thing. Like, who's there doing that? No one. You can't show me a Ukrainian public figure who's saying, I'm a proud Nazi. So it's a conspiracy, and it takes all the marks of a conspiracy, and you probably shouldn't believe that.
They hated everything Russian and intended to rid the country of Russian people and the Russian language.
If they hated everything Russian, you got to ask yourself, why? What caused that?
The language ombudsman, Taras Kremen, said Ukraine is for Ukrainians. According to the Secretary of National Security and Defense, Alexei Danilov, the Russian language needs to vanish from Ukrainian territory. And he called Russian people rats. They need to be poisoned and they need to be destroyed.
And the Russians have said far worse things about the Ukrainians. But we're not talking about that, are we?
Any possible means. What is happening right now in Ukraine is in essence a total ban of the Russian language. Starting in the fall of last year, there was a full ban on the studying of language in schools added onto the other laws I mentioned, even study of Russian as a foreign language. And our former Western partners haven't responded to that at all. They're advancing the principle of diversity and the protection for national and cultural identity, but they're only doing so in their own home. The pro-Western elements are not responding to what's happening at all. One clear example of them.
So you want them to respond to what's going on about language, but you don't want them to respond to a military invasion. Like, wrap that around your head. This is the guy that's going to be chairing the presidency of the Security Council for the next month. This is the very same guy.
Is the refusal to allow to brief us today Mr. Gerdes. It's clear that criticism of Ukraine and is absolutely unacceptable for them, as they think. Mr. President, there's rusophobia rampaging through Ukraine. This is taking on many manifestations. I mentioned a few of them already. That is the fight against Russian books. And right now, just like in Nazi Germany, they're being destroyed. There's also a shameful war against monuments and geographical names.
They've taken down monuments to Soviet heroes because they don't like the people that conquered them. They don't like the language of the people that conquered them. I know of one account of a professor talking about how, look, his students refuse to even spell Russia with a capital R. And he's not going to take off any points for that because that's, he feels that sentiment. If you call it Muscovy, which they're considering actually renaming Russia to Muscovy, they'll be fine with that too. Because they don't like you. Because you're invading. Because you've been dominating. Because you've been really cruel to them over time. But your issue is the language, that they're not willing to let people use your language. How freaking arrogant.
Have to do with Russia, but that was all outlined in full by our briefers. The repressions in Ukraine are happening because someone spoke one word of Russia, or sang a Russian song, or read Russian news, or sent Russian messages on their phone. What is happening is a true linguistic inquisition,
and the same is happening in Russia. People going to jail in Crimea, going to jail for singing a Ukrainian song, going to jail in Russia for somebody's whose daughter wrote a pro-peace drawing in school, and he went to jail for that. Come on, tell the whole story.
It is an obscurantism, and what is happening is that innocent people are suffering for it and dying. All of this is happening before the eyes of our Western colleagues. Incidentally, they also haven't. They've also started to ban everything Russia. We can see that very clearly. And we see that you have carefully hid your hatred to our country and our religion and language and culture.
Okay, hatred toward your country wasn't there before you invaded. Toward your religion, nobody cares. Toward your culture, it's not the culture, it's the oppressive, dominating actions that you have taken. It's not about whether you have babushka dolls. That's not it. It's not that at all.
And no condemnations of our special military operation can explain the extent of rusophobia in your countries.
Oh, yes, it can. In fact, look, again, he's asserting something as if it's true. That's exactly the opposite of the reality that it is. It all hinges on this invasion.
Colleagues, there's another aspect that I wish to draw your attention to today. This is the ongoing combating of the Kiev regime, the combat against the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which has nothing to do with Russia. And
except that it was getting official lines from Russia through the Orthodox Church, and it was being used as kind of a spy network. But other than that, I mean...
Lashinsky spoke about that today too. Recently, there was a Security Council meeting on this topic. I think many of you will recall that meeting. Up until then, up until now, the situation has only worsened. There were seizures of Orthodox churches and parishes, and there was also the seizure of the Kiev Pechersky monastery, and the Zelensky regime intends to do that on the 28th of March, and this step is yet another step in this war.
Well, when you weaponize the church, well, there's a problem there.
In conclusion, I wish to stress the fact that we convened today's meeting not in order to talk about the domestic problems of Ukraine. The rusophobic
Yeah, who wants to talk about the actual war and the death and destruction and the killing and the rape and the murder? We don't want to talk about that. After all, we're only the UN Security Council. Let's just talk about something important, like denigrating our language.
Campaign is off the scales in this country. It was unleashed by Zelensky, and it is directly threatening international peace and security.
Did you catch that? He's saying that the denigration of the Russian language in Ukraine is directly threatening international peace and security, not the Russians spilling over the border with 200,000 men in order to overtake the country and make it a vassal state.
In this situation, no peace and good neighborly relationship with Ukraine is possible in principle. We continue to wish our Ukrainian neighbors, we continue to wish that they will just simply observe the basic rights and freedoms which all of our Western colleagues are so much cherish in their own homes.
Are you freaking kidding me? Observe the basic rights and freedoms when you're bringing in tanks and you're worried about them speaking Russian. Unbelievable.
The reason there are other standards applying to Ukraine. And I want to ask our Swiss neighbors, in order to be Swiss, do you have to renounce your Italian, French, or your German identity?
Okay, so I get what he's trying to say there. So the Swiss speak other languages, but you have to renounce German. Look, I bet during World War II, it probably wasn't that cool to speak German in Switzerland. And, people probably were a little less interested in that. My grandfather came to the United States just before World War II from Germany. He had a thick German accent. He gave away his shortwave radio so that nobody would think anything nefarious was going on in his home. Right? I mean, just think how a rational person might have seen something like that. Guy with a thick German accent in America with the shortwave radio. So my grandfather was thinking. He is not thinking here. He's thinking, well, they should be able to speak whatever they want.
Does that imperil the integrity of your nation? And if not, then where's your criticism of what the Kiev authorities are doing to Russians? a long-term and sustainable peace in Europe cannot be built based on rusophobia. I want that to be abundantly clear. I also hope that today you will spare us your arguments that in the spirit of, well, it's your fault, as we heard, because Russophobia in Ukraine has been evolving long before the 24th of February 2022.
So Russophobia is the cause for the problems that we now are experiencing, and it's been there for a long time, is what he's saying.
Protecting the despicable acts of their Kiev proteges and pretending like they're the response for our acts. You're not only
pretending that they're the response for your acts. What? Like, yeah, you know, we didn't have any choice. I mean, these Russians were being just persecuted by those Ukrainians. They're bad.
You're not only doing yourself no credit, but you're devaluing your own high standards and your values, and you're creating the risk of degradation of your societies up until to the point of the Kiev's standards. We hope that this scenario can be avoided. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the guy that's actually going to be in charge for the month of April. So that's why this is an important thing. So I hope that helps give you some perspective of just how nutty the Russians can be when they bring forward something to the UN Security Council. But I also don't believe that they can actually do much just because they're in charge of the UN Security Council. And at least that's a little comforting. If this was useful to you, would you please give me a like, spread this, share this with someone. You can buy me a coffee if you want to support me. In the links below, you can find links to United 24, Samaritan's Purse, and other ways that you can contribute to the cause. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.